Camilla's butler dropped a key, and in that single accidental moment, the palace walls seemed to hold their breath. The guard who spotted it had no idea he was holding the one object the Queen never meant the world to see. Because behind a locked door, buried deeper than any royal secret, lay a hidden treasure room that could rewrite everything the monarchy ever claimed to be. And it all began the second that key hit the marble floor. The marble floors of the royal estate gleamed under the soft morning light, each tile reflecting a history that had been whispered through generations but never spoken aloud. The courtyard was silent now, yet the echo of that silence carried a weight, a subtle reminder that in these halls even the smallest misstep could ripple like a storm. Camilla's butler moved with the practiced precision of a man whose entire life had been devoted to service. Every step, every measured motion had been honed over decades, and yet, in that rare moment of distraction, he faltered, the key slipped. It fell from his fingers like a sudden note of discord, its descent silent, almost reverent, until it struck the polished floor with a faint but undeniable clink. The camera drifts slowly through the palace gates, past gilded banisters and velvet drapes, lingering on the ornate key now lying among the shadows. Its design was intricate, engraved with an archaic royal crest that seemed almost alive in the morning sun. The butler's breath caught in his chest not from fear of punishment, but from the fragile weight of history that had been entrusted to him. Moments later, a shadow moved along the corridor. The patrolling guard, silent as a ghost, paused mid-step. His trained eyes fixed on the key, its unexpected presence demanding acknowledgement. His hand hovered near the hilt of his ceremonial sword, but it was not drawn, not yet. He did not know what this key opened, nor the doors it might forever unlock. And perhaps the butler himself had not known until this very instant. The palace, in all its quiet grandeur, seemed to inhale. The echo of boots on marble was not just sound, it was discipline made audible, a testament to centuries of unwavering protocol. But discipline alone could not shield the heart from curiosity, nor prevent the mind from racing with unspoken possibilities. The guard's gaze lingered on the key, as though trying to read the stories engraved into its metal surface. Camilla's butler bent slowly, the motion measured, almost ritualistic, each finger trembling as he retrieved the key. He felt a strange combination of dread and longing. He had been a guardian of secrets for so long, yet never had he felt the burden so acutely. In his mind's eye, he saw flickering images, corridors hidden behind false walls, rooms lined with velvet and gold, artifacts untouched by light for decades. Each vision teased the imagination, each a moral test wrapped in the gilded form of luxury. Meanwhile, the guard shifted his stance, subtle yet deliberate. His duty demanded vigilance, but his human instinct sensed something beyond protocol, a threshold of curiosity that was as old as the palace itself. He knew better than to act rashly, yet he could not help the whisper of thought. What lies beyond the doors that were never meant to be opened? The camera glides down a long hallway, the ornate chandeliers casting fractured patterns of light across the floor. Velvet drapes sway faintly as if disturbed by a hidden breeze, though no door is open. The butler's hands close around the key, feeling its cold weight, and in that touch a question stirs. Loyalty to the living, or loyalty to the secrets of generations past? Footsteps echo in the distance, not close, yet not far. The palace breathes with anticipation, every surface, every gilded edge, holding its own silent counsel. The key, though small, becomes a symbol, a pivot around which the fates of those within these walls may turn. The butler straightens, bowing his head in ritual respect, yet the tension tightens around his chest like a vice. The dichotomy is clear, a lifetime of obedience, now measured against the gravity of forbidden knowledge. In the adjacent hall, portraits of former monarchs stare silently. Their eyes, captured in oil and canvas, seem almost to judge the small act, the tiny slip that might herald consequences no one could yet predict. The guard watches the butler, noting every subtle twitch, every hesitation. There is a quiet dialogue here, wordless yet filled with meaning, and negotiation of trust, suspicion, and unspoken protocol. Camilla herself is elsewhere, her presence felt even in absence. The faint perfume of her chambers drifts through the corridors, mingling with the dust of history and the faint scent of polished wood. Her butler's loyalty is as much to her as to the palace itself, yet the key challenges the very essence of that allegiance. One wrong step, one glance misinterpreted, could unravel decades of disciplined service. The camera moves to a narrow corridor beyond the main hall, glimpsing partially concealed doors, ornate but unmarked. Gold handles glint in the muted light, hinting at wealth and mystery contained within. The key in the butler's hand seems to resonate with these hidden portals, as though aware of the secrets it was made to guard. He breathes slowly, the echo of his inhalation loud in the silent expanse. He cannot yet know which door this key fits, nor the revelations that await, but tension mounts. A shadow passes once more, fleeting yet deliberate. The guard's eyes follow it, trained and unyielding, sensing that the key's fall was more than mere accident. Somewhere within these halls, a hidden truth waits, and both loyalty and duty teeter on the edge of revelation. The butler feels a tremor of fear, not for himself, but for the consequences of what might be revealed, a treasure room untouched for centuries, perhaps holding relics, secrets, and the moral ambiguities of past monarchs. Hours earlier, no one could have imagined that a key, so small and seemingly insignificant, would set in motion a chain of events that tested the very fiber of human fidelity. And now, in this quiet opulence, the first link had fallen into place. The palace, with all its grandeur and whispering history, held its breath. The guard and the butler, each aware of their roles yet unsure of the outcome, became unwitting participants in a drama centuries in the making. The light shifts as morning slowly fades into afternoon. Shadows lengthen across marble floors, creeping along corridors like silent observers. Every step, every glance carries meaning. The key rests in the butler's palm, innocuous to the untrained eye, monumental to those who understand the weight of duty. The question lingers: what treasures lie beyond doors that were never meant to be opened? And more urgently, who will survive the moral reckoning that discovery brings? A shadow passes through the corridor once again, brushing the key with an almost imperceptible whisper of movement. Something hidden is stirring, and the quiet act of a dropped key is about to unravel centuries of secrecy. The echo of the key's fall still vibrated in the butler's mind as he rose from the polished floor. He tucked it carefully into the inner pocket of his tailored coat, a pocket no casual observer would notice. Every motion was deliberate, the kind only a lifetime of service could produce. Yet even as his hands moved with precision, his heart betrayed him, hammering a rhythm in time with the unseen tension of the palace itself. Through the narrow corridor, the patrolling guard lingered just beyond the threshold of observation. His posture was rigid, his gaze fixed. There was no accusation in his eyes, only awareness, a quiet calculation born from years of duty. The key had disrupted the delicate balance of obedience and secrecy, and the guard felt the weight of the palace's invisible scales tipping ever so slightly. Camilla's butler paused, listening. Somewhere in the distance, the subtle sound of whispered footsteps, perhaps a maid moving between chambers, perhaps another guard, breathed life into the otherwise silent corridors. Each sound was amplified, layered with significance. The palace, once merely a building of stone and gilded decoration, had transformed into a living organism, sensitive, watchful, almost sentient in its anticipation of what was to come. He allowed himself a single glance down the hallway. Hidden doors, their frames ornate yet unmarked, beckoned silently. A faint glimmer of sunlight caught a gilded handle, momentarily revealing the faint scratches and subtle imperfections that marked the passage of countless hands over decades. Those hands, like his own, had touched history and kept it hidden. Yet now, the key in his possession was the first catalyst in what could become an irreversible unraveling. The guard stepped closer, his boots muffled against the velvet runners. He did not speak. There was no need. The silent exchange, the tilt of the butler's head, the slight tightening of his jaw conveyed more than words ever could. They both understood the stakes. The key was not just a piece of metal. It was a symbol, a test, a potential breach of everything the palace represented. A faint creak echoed from above, a door shifting imperceptibly, as if the palace itself were aware of the unfolding drama. The butler's hand tightened around the key, and in that simple gesture, decades of unwavering service collided with a sudden awareness of moral peril. What did loyalty demand in the face of forbidden knowledge? And what of duty when the rules themselves seemed to tremble under the weight of history? He continued down the hallway, each step measured, the echo bouncing softly against walls lined with ancestral portraits. The faces in oil and canvas followed him with painted eyes that seemed to shimmer in the filtered light. Each monarch had maintained their own secrets, left their own legacies unspoken, and now the butler was being tested by the same standards centuries later. Meanwhile, the guard's mind worked methodically. Every corridor, every servant, every documented protocol was catalogued in his memory. He had been trained to detect anomalies, to observe what others overlooked, and this key, innocuous to an outsider, was an anomaly of the highest order. His fingers brushed against the hilt of his ceremonial sword, not in preparation for violence, but as a grounding ritual, a reminder that the palace's codes were not mere suggestions. As the butler approached the end of the hallway, he paused at a subtle irregularity in the wall's pattern. A slight variation in the woodwork, barely noticeable unless one's attention was acute. His breathing slowed. The palace, in its meticulous perfection, had left traces of its hidden truths for those who knew where to look. And he did. He always had. The air shifted slightly, carrying the faint metallic tang of aged secrets. He knew instinctively that one more step could bring him closer to a doorway that had been sealed off from all but the most trusted. His hand moved to the key. It felt heavier now, laden not with mere metal, but with centuries of expectation, with the silent judgment of ancestors long gone. From behind the guard followed, careful to remain unseen, silent as a shadow. His presence was felt rather than heard, an almost imperceptible heartbeat in the palace's quiet symphony. He understood that intervention now could jeopardize more than protocol. It could unravel human trust, the delicate fabric binding servant to monarch, protector to secret. The butler reached the subtle irregularity in the wall and pressed lightly. There was a click, delicate yet resonant, a sound that seemed to echo far beyond the physical. A panel shifted, revealing a narrow glimpse into the darkness beyond. Gold and velvet, shadows and dust, a faint glimmer that spoke of treasures untouched for decades. His breath caught. The camera lingers, drifting through the barely opened panel, catching the glint of what could only be described as objects of immense historical weight. Ornate chests, glimmering artifacts, rolled parchments, and gilded reliquaries. The palace had hidden more than wealth. It had hidden moral choices, treaties, secrets that could rewrite history. The butler's eyes flicked to the guard, whose face was calm yet alert, reflecting a controlled curiosity. The unspoken agreement between them hung in the air. Discovery was imminent, but action must be deliberate. Every second carried consequence. The key, in that moment, was not merely an object, but a bridge between loyalty and revelation, between obedience and conscience. Suddenly, the faintest sound broke the tension, a whisper of movement from deeper within the palace. Perhaps a maid adjusting curtains, perhaps another guard on routine rounds, perhaps a shadow of history itself stirring. The butler froze, the guard's hand tightened near his sword. Time seemed to slow, the palace itself held its breath. They stepped forward together, guided by instinct as much as protocol. Each step revealed more. Ornate carvings on walls, tapestries depicting battles long past, and subtle signs that the palace had always known this room would be found one day by the right hands at the right time. The air grew heavier, the scent of aged wood and gold mingling with a faint chill, as though the room had been sealed against the passage of ordinary life. The butler finally paused at the threshold of the room beyond the panel. The key turned in the lock with an almost musical precision. A metallic resonance rang softly through the hallways, a sound at once ordinary and extraordinary. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a treasure room untouched by time, bathed in muted sunlight that filtered through tiny, hidden windows. Dust motes floated lazily in the beams, and the faint scent of history was overpowering. The camera glides across the room. Gilded relics, velvet-lined cases, stacks of manuscripts tied with faded ribbons, and artifacts whose significance was immediately evident to those who understood history. But it was not wealth alone that filled the room, it was the weight of decisions, the moral compromises of past rulers, the silent choices that had shaped the monarchy for centuries. For a long moment, the butler simply stood, absorbing the enormity of what he had uncovered. His life had been one of service, of unquestioned loyalty, and yet here was a secret that demanded more than obedience. It demanded judgment, reflection, conscience. The guard stepped in beside him, careful not to disturb the fragile equilibrium. His eyes scanned the room, cataloguing every detail, aware that what lay before him was a test not of strength, but of moral fortitude. Duty and loyalty intertwined in a delicate dance, and neither man could predict where it would lead. The key, now resting in the butler's hand, had revealed far more than a room of treasures. It had unveiled the first layer of a centuries-old moral puzzle, one that would challenge both the living and the memory of those who had come before. The palace, in all its grandeur, seemed to exhale, as if acknowledging the passage of guardianship from one era to the next. And then, almost imperceptibly, the whisper of a draught hinted at another presence, a shadow moving in the distance, unseen but undeniably near. The butler's hand tightened on the key, the guard's senses sharpened. The palace was no longer merely a building of walls and corridors. It had become a crucible of loyalty, secrecy, and moral reckoning. The camera lingers on the key one final time, glinting in the filtered light, before drifting upward to the ceiling, where shadows from the ornate chandeliers dance across painted murals. The first act of discovery is complete, but the moral and emotional journey is only beginning. The dropped key, now returned to purpose, has unlocked more than a door. It has opened a corridor of consequences. A shadow stirs deeper in the palace, hinting that what lies ahead will test every ounce of duty, loyalty, and conscience. The palace, once a silent observer of centuries, had awakened to a subtle tremor. What had seemed an insignificant disturbance, a small key falling to the marble floor, was no longer so simple. Wordless alerts passed through the corridors, invisible to most but unmistakable to those trained in the language of protocol. The air itself seemed to hum with tension, carrying the weight of potential discovery, of secrets that had been preserved for generations. The guard, stationed at the edge of the first hallways, moved with deliberate discretion. Each step was measured, each glance calibrated to convey nothing yet absorb everything. His first action was to document the anomaly quietly, as protocol demanded. A note to be passed, a whisper to the next in command, a chain of responsibility that wound through the palace like veins. Nothing escaped these procedures. Every staff member, every servant, was an artery in the living organism of the monarchy. Meanwhile, Camilla's butler retreated to the shadows of the estate, his mind racing with questions he dared not voice aloud. He had spent decades navigating the labyrinthine rules that governed palace life, yet this key had challenged every certainty. His loyalty to Camilla and to the palace itself collided in a silent moral storm. Could he risk honesty, or would concealment serve the greater good? And in the corridors of power, who truly defined the greater good? The camera drifts along the polished corridors, lingering on the portraits of former monarchs. Their eyes, painted with deliberate scrutiny, seemed to follow the subtle stirrings of the palace staff. Each painted gaze, each carved frame, was a reminder. Protocol was absolute, but history was full of quiet rebellions, of whispers that defied authority without ever leaving a trace. The first whispers reached the upper echelon of palace administration. A missing key, a potentially misplaced artifact, a breach of discipline. The reaction was immediate, silent, and precise. Archival documents were consulted, coded decrees reviewed, and the subtle mechanisms of palace governance activated. A hidden ledger, bound in aged leather and secured behind centuries of trust, became the first point of scrutiny. Its pages, filled with symbols, numbers, and annotations, hinted at knowledge that few had ever been privy to, a map of secrets, of protocol intertwined with privilege, and the faint trace of treasure long kept from the public eye. Camilla's butler was summoned not with the clang of accusation, but with the measured summons of protocol. He entered the administrative chambers, each footstep echoing in the stillness, aware that eyes unseen were assessing not just his actions but his intentions. The questions he would face were subtle, probing, layered with expectation. A simple error might be excused, a lapse in judgment, even momentary, could unravel decades of trust. The investigators, their motions precise and deliberate, examined the situation with meticulous care. Their first task was to reconstruct the chain of events, tracing the butler's movements, the guard's patrols, and the subtle indicators left behind by human error. They moved like a tide, quiet yet unstoppable, cataloguing each anomaly with the precision of archivists and the vigilance of those who understood the fragility of royal order. In the quiet chambers, the butler answered questions with careful candor. Every word was weighed, every hesitation calculated. His lifelong service was evident in his composure, yet beneath the surface, tension rippled like an undercurrent. He balanced on the razor's edge between personal loyalty and institutional expectation. The investigators probed subtly, revealing inconsistencies in staff recollections, minor gaps that hinted at either error or deliberate concealment. The palace itself seemed to conspire with the narrative. Hidden corridors, ornate but unmarked, offered possibilities that were both practical and dangerous. The scent of aged wood, the soft whisper of air through ancient vents, became clues in the investigation as much as the ledger or the key itself. Every sensory detail mattered. Every overlooked moment might be the key to understanding the depth of secrecy embedded within these walls. Archival documents revealed more than procedural records. They hinted at legacy and lineage, treaties and transactions, moral compromises preserved under the guise of duty. The butler's recollection of past events, his subtle corrections and careful affirmations, became critical threads in a tapestry that had been woven over centuries. The tension was not simply about a misplaced key or a rumored treasure. It was about the continuity of trust, about the delicate balance between revelation and discretion. As the investigation unfolded, subtle alliances formed among staff. Some whispered quietly in corners, their glances carrying the weight of suspicion, curiosity, and unspoken concern. The palace hierarchy, though rigid, was not impervious to the human element. Each servant, each guard, each administrator carried their own code of ethics, their own interpretation of duty, and in this the butler found both comfort and peril. He was neither alone nor fully understood, caught between the loyalties of individuals and the imperatives of the institution. The ledger, the key, the faint disturbances in protocol, all became points of meditation, turning the palace into a living puzzle. Investigators cross-referenced entries with historical records, noting patterns that hinted at previous breaches, subtle acts of defiance, and moments of concealed truth. Each discovery intensified the moral tension. How much of the palace's integrity relied on deliberate omission? How much depended on the unquestioned loyalty of its servants? Meanwhile, the butler continued to navigate the scrutiny with quiet poise. His lifetime of service had trained him to anticipate questioning, to read intent as acutely as text. He offered answers that were precise yet guarded, aware that even the slightest disclosure could open pathways the palace was not prepared to reveal. Yet, internally, he wrestled with the dissonance between absolute loyalty to the living monarch and the silent obligations owed to history itself. In another wing of the palace, the guard who had first observed the key maintained his vigilance. He catalogued movements, noted minor irregularities, and observed human behavior with clinical attention. Yet beneath his professional detachment, a moral question began to take root. What is duty when loyalty collides with truth? Each step he took, each subtle glance, was a study in restraint, a measure of personal ethics against institutional demands. The camera lingers on the hidden corridors once more. Their shadows are deeper now, enriched with the knowledge that something significant has been set in motion. Velvet drapes sway slightly in the filtered light, and the faint glint of gold catches a whisper of movement. The palace is alive with potential revelation, each element a character in the unfolding drama. The first threads of suspicion begin to weave themselves together. Small inconsistencies in staff statements, a ledger entry misaligned with recorded events, and the butler's subtle hesitations hint at larger mysteries yet uncovered. The investigative process is slow, deliberate, almost ritualistic, a dance of procedure and intuition that will determine the palace's ability to protect itself from internal collapse. As part one of this chapter draws to a close, the weight of the situation begins to press down on every character. Loyalty, discretion, and the unspoken moral obligations of centuries converge in subtle glances, whispered observations, and the silent pressure of duty. The key has already done its work. It has awakened curiosity, tested discipline, and begun the delicate unraveling of carefully maintained secrecy. The palace, with all its grandeur, now exists in a suspended state of anticipation. Every corridor, every chamber, every servant holds a fragment of the emerging story. The investigative machinery has begun to move, slowly but inexorably, and no one within these walls will remain untouched by the ramifications. A ledger, bound in leather and coded in symbols long forgotten, waits to reveal its secrets. Its discovery hints that the palace may have been hiding more than gold or artifacts, perhaps knowledge, that some within its walls would kill to protect. The tension is rising, and what is uncovered next could challenge everything they believe about loyalty and trust. The ledger rested on the polished oak desk like a silent sentinel, its leather cover worn smooth by decades of hands who had touched it in quiet reverence. Camilla's butler approached with the careful precision of a man fully aware that even the smallest gesture carried consequence. He lifted the cover, revealing pages filled with a language of symbols, annotations, and faint pencil, marks the handwriting of those long gone, but whose intentions still resonated in the palace air. The investigators had already begun to pore over its contents. Guards and administrators hovered nearby, their presence respectful yet vigilant. Each glance at the ledger, each soft murmur, was layered with the weight of centuries, old protocol. What they were seeing was more than records. It was a map of loyalty and secrecy, a subtle index of moral decisions preserved beneath the veneer of ceremonial routine. The camera drifts along the room, capturing the subtle tension that fills the space. Sunlight filters through tall windows, falling on dust motes that dance lazily in the air, illuminated like tiny fragments of history itself. The butler's fingers trace faded symbols on the page, recognizing patterns that others might dismiss as random. Yet he knows these symbols are deliberate markers of privilege, instructions, and warnings that had been passed down, hidden in plain sight, for generations. Questions began to emerge. Why had certain entries been highlighted? Why did some names recur alongside notes about restricted chambers and sealed artifacts? What exactly was meant by the cryptic references to the room beyond the gold door? Each revelation sharpened the tension. Protocol demanded silence, yet human curiosity pressed relentlessly against the walls of discretion. The butler answered quietly when asked about his knowledge, careful to measure every word. He had served faithfully, adhered to orders, and never breached trust. Yet here in this room, the boundaries of service and moral responsibility blurred. He spoke of duties of oversight, of adherence to instructions, all while revealing nothing the ledger itself could not confirm. The investigators listened, their expressions neutral, though the subtle tightening of brows suggested a mind at work, piecing together fragments into a coherent and troubling picture. Meanwhile, the guard who had discovered the key maintained a quiet watch, cataloguing movements, gestures, and statements with professional precision. Every staff member became a potential thread in the web of secrecy and disclosure. No casual movement went unnoticed, no glance unrecorded in the mind of a man trained to see the subtle interplay between loyalty and deception. The camera shifts to a smaller room, tucked away behind tall doors carved with intricate patterns. Inside, palace staff convened in hushed tones, whispering about irregularities in routine duties and the appearance of the key. Each whisper carried the dual weight of curiosity and fear. Even minor discrepancies in schedules or lapses in memory became significant tiny fissures, hinting at larger structural cracks in the palace's web of secrecy. The ledger revealed more than logistical anomalies. It suggested intent. Certain passages hinted that someone within the palace may have been aware of the treasure all along. Notes about hidden keys, instructions for discreet handling, and references to long, forgotten ceremonial objects painted a picture of deliberate concealment. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but for trained eyes and a lifetime of service, the implications were undeniable. Camilla's butler found himself caught in a storm of moral contemplation. His lifelong loyalty collided with an unsettling realization. Knowledge could no longer remain neutral. If the treasure truly existed, if the room beyond the gold door held the artifacts suggested by the ledger, then his decisions would affect not only the present, but the legacy of the monarchy itself. How much could he reveal without compromising the institution he had sworn to protect? How much could he conceal before he betrayed truth? The investigators moved deliberately, comparing ledger entries to architectural plans and staff schedules. Their methodology was meticulous, an exacting balance of deduction and observation, where intuition was guided by centuries of codified procedure. Every misalignment, every inconsistency, became a potential clue. The palace's hierarchy was revealed not just in titles and ranks, but in how individuals responded under subtle pressure, who deferred, who probed, who hesitated, and who spoke with deliberate candor. A small tension began to crystallize among the staff. The butler, revered for decades of unwavering service, found himself both trusted and scrutinized. The guard, whose discovery had initiated this chain of events, walked the thin line between observation and interference. Others, unaware of the key's significance, sensed only the atmosphere, a heightened state of awareness that made even ordinary tasks feel consequential. As the investigation unfolded, small discoveries hinted at larger mysteries. A coded notation in the ledger, for instance, referred to a vault of echoes, a phrase that had no immediate meaning to the uninitiated. Another entry suggested that certain artifacts were to remain in shadow, an instruction repeated across multiple generations. The moral calculus embedded in these notes was unmistakable. The palace itself had long been a custodian not just of wealth, but of ethical responsibility, historical discretion, and concealed truths. The camera pans across corridors where minor irregularities had been reported. A door slightly ajar, a misplaced vase, a shadow moving against expectation. These small anomalies, when viewed through the lens of protocol and human behavior, became threads in a growing narrative. The palace was revealing itself not as a static monument, but as a living archive, full of hints, warnings, and moral signposts. Camilla's butler, standing amid the investigators and the guard, allowed himself a brief inward reflection. He had spent decades performing duties with mechanical precision, but now he was confronted with questions that could not be answered with obedience alone. Knowledge, discretion, and conscience had converged, creating a moment that demanded both courage and restraint. Outside the room, hidden corridors awaited exploration. Some passages were rarely traversed, others had been sealed for decades. The ledger implied that the key might open more than one door, that the act of discovery could trigger a cascade of consequences. Who among the staff had prior knowledge? Who had concealed intentions? The uncertainty, the subtle interplay of personal and institutional loyalty, created a tension that was palpable even in silence. The investigators pressed further, examining staff records, cross-referencing duty rosters, and interviewing those whose recollections were incomplete or inconsistent. Even the smallest deviation from routine became significant, suggesting that the palace's long-maintained equilibrium was fragile, and that hidden truths might be lying in wait, carefully concealed by layers of protocol and discretion. The guard's observations became increasingly critical. He noticed micro-expressions, slight hesitations, and changes in tone, each revealing the undercurrent of uncertainty and the personal stakes involved. It became clear that the palace's stability relied not merely on structural integrity or ceremonial adherence, but on human behavior, on trust, silence, and the ethical choices of each individual within these walls. As Part 2 unfolds, the ledger begins to yield its secrets more definitively. Certain entries confirm that someone had intentionally guided the placement of keys, the timing of patrols, and the concealment of artifacts. The moral weight of the discovery becomes clear. The palace had been safeguarding not only treasures, but a code of ethics, a silent archive of decisions that had shaped history behind closed doors. Camilla's butler, the guard, and the investigators all confront the same unspoken truth. This is no longer a matter of misplaced objects, but of moral responsibility. Knowledge of the treasure, even in its partial revelation, alters the dynamics of loyalty, duty, and conscience. Each participant is forced to consider their role in preserving or exposing what the palace has protected for centuries. The camera lingers on the ledger one final time, its pages open to notes that hint at alliances, concealments, and deliberate omissions. Outside, the corridors stretch silently, waiting for the next discovery, the next decision, the next act of courage or compromise. The palace remains a repository of history and moral complexity, each shadow and gilded surface holding the potential for revelation. A coded entry hints at someone within the palace who may have known more than they admitted. The next steps could unravel alliances, reveal hidden intentions, and force every character to confront the tension between loyalty and truth. The investigation has only just begun, and the shadows of the past are stirring. The palace corridors, long accustomed to the rhythm of daily routines, had changed. They carried a weight, now a quiet pressure, a tension that was invisible to most but impossible for the trained eye to ignore. The key had been found, the ledger had revealed its coded secrets, and the undercurrent of curiosity had transformed into a pulse of near-visible energy. Camilla's butler moved through these halls with his usual poise, yet even he could feel the subtle tremor beneath the marble and velvet. The guard, once merely a silent observer, now found himself at the center of a growing moral and procedural storm. Every step he took echoed with consequence, each glance a test of perception and restraint. He had spent years maintaining order, following protocol to the letter, but the knowledge of the key, the ledger, and the potential treasure had shifted the balance. Duty demanded vigilance, but conscience urged caution, and curiosity whispered with a tempting persistence. Hidden corridors awaited exploration. Some were used daily, others sealed for decades, their secrets preserved under centuries of ritual and decorum. The guard traced the path he had memorized from the ledger and from the butler's subtle indications. He moved silently, eyes scanning every carving, every shadow, every flicker of light. The palace seemed to breathe around him, its grand halls and narrow passages conspiring to reveal or conceal as it saw fit. Camilla's butler followed closely, a figure of quiet authority and guidance. He did not lead in the obvious sense. Instead, he offered subtle cues, gestures, and moments of knowledge that nudged the guard toward discovery without forcing exposure. His loyalty was complex, to Camilla, to the institution, and now to the moral integrity of what lay hidden behind the doors of the palace. The camera drifts down a rarely used corridor, its walls lined with tapestries that tell the story of kings and queens who had walked these halls long before the current generation. Each thread, each stitch, carries history and meaning. Some depicted victories, others betrayals, and one or two, almost imperceptibly, alluded to secrets kept from public record. The guard's gaze lingered on these details, realizing that the visual record of loyalty and deception might itself hold clues to the location of the hidden treasure. Inside the corridors, staff moved with deliberate normalcy, unaware of the unfolding moral and procedural drama. A maid carrying fresh linens glanced briefly at the guard and butler, but continued her route, oblivious to the significance of their mission. The butler noted this with a quiet efficiency, understanding that even unintentional observations could complicate matters. Every interaction, however subtle, carried weight in a palace that had long thrived on discretion and hierarchy. The first confrontation emerged, not with raised voices, but in the delicate interplay of expectation and morality. A senior administrator, summoned by the ledger's coded entries, intercepted the guard in a narrow hallway. "I understand you've been reviewing the ledger," he said, voice calm but edged with authority. "I trust your observations are strictly procedural. The guard's response was measured, professional, yet beneath the surface, he wrestled with the ethical implications of what he knew. "Yes," he said, each syllable deliberate, strictly procedural. Any deviation would compromise the integrity of the palace. The administrator nodded slowly, but his eyes betrayed a subtle calculation. He understood the tension between protocol and discovery, between duty and conscience. This was no ordinary investigation. It was a moral test, a measure of trust and ethical fortitude. Meanwhile, the butler moved ahead, checking the subtle markers along the corridors, slight variations in the woodwork, traces of dust disturbed, minor irregularities that suggested hidden doors or passages. His experience was invaluable. Decades of intimate knowledge of the palace allowed him to anticipate where secrets might lie, and he guided the guard without overtly directing. Their silent collaboration created a rhythm of cautious exploration, each step forward revealing more questions than answers. The camera glides over hidden doors, faintly outlined by the afternoon light streaming through narrow windows. Gold handles glint subtly, dust motes catching the light like tiny specters of the past. The atmosphere is thick with anticipation. The guard's hand brushes the hilt of his sword, not in readiness for conflict, but as a grounding ritual, a reminder that in these corridors, moral courage mattered as much as physical preparedness. They reached a section of the palace rarely traversed by anyone but the most senior staff. The walls here were lined with portraits of monarchs whose decisions had shaped the course of the nation. Their painted eyes seemed almost alive, watching, judging, reminding those who passed of the weight of history. The butler's gaze lingered on one portrait in particular, a queen whose expression was stern yet enigmatic, as though she had foreseen the tests of loyalty and discretion that would confront future generations. A soft noise interrupted the quiet, a door creaking, perhaps, or the shifting of a hidden panel. Both men froze. The palace seemed to exhale, the sound amplified in the vast emptiness of the hall. They exchanged a brief glance, an unspoken acknowledgement of the stakes. The hidden treasure was near, yet the moral calculus remained complex. To proceed required not only vigilance but judgment, for the consequences of discovery could extend beyond the physical into the ethical and historical. The guard's mind wandered briefly to the ledger, recalling coded references to rooms labeled with cryptic annotations, Vault of Shadows, Chamber of Echoes. Each term hinted at secrecy preserved not merely for wealth, but for ethical and political reasons. These were not frivolous labels, they were warnings, legacies of discretion passed down through generations. The challenge was to navigate them without compromising the palace's integrity. Camilla's butler led the guard to a subtle irregularity in the wall, almost imperceptible, marked by a faint indentation and a shadowed line. He gestured lightly, just enough for the guard to notice. The guard nodded, understanding the silent cue, the key, the discovery, and the moral responsibility of access all converged here. With careful precision, he prepared to test the hidden mechanism. Before he could act, another staff member appeared in the hallway, a junior administrator, unaware of the key's significance, but whose presence introduced a sudden tension. The butler stepped slightly forward, subtly redirecting the path of both men to preserve secrecy. The administrator's brief glance passed over the pair without suspicion, continuing his route down the corridor. In that instant, the delicate balance between discretion and exposure became painfully clear. The palace's secrets depended not only on locks and keys, but on human judgment. The camera moves along the corridor once more, catching glimpses of ornate doors, gilded handles, and tapestries that ripple faintly with the palace's internal draft. Shadows stretch and contract, whispering hints of hidden chambers and forgotten history. The tension rises with each step. as if the palace itself were guiding the men toward discovery, but testing their morality along the way. At the end of the hallway, a small panel, barely visible, hinted at a concealed doorway. Dust had settled unevenly, suggesting infrequent use. The guard and the butler exchanged a glance, understanding without words that they were at the threshold. This was the point where protocol, loyalty, and conscience converged. One more action could reveal treasures untouched for decades, or ignite questions that might shake the palace to its foundations. The butler paused, resting a hand lightly on the panel. The key in his pocket seemed suddenly heavier, laden with centuries of expectation. The guard's fingers brushed his sword hilt instinctively, a gesture of grounding rather than aggression. Both men understood that this was not simply a physical barrier. It was a moral threshold, a test of character, discretion, and ethical judgment. In the stillness, the palace seemed to hold its breath. The silence was punctuated only by the faint whisper of air through hidden vents, the muted creak of distant doors, and the soft, deliberate footsteps of two men poised at the edge of revelation. Every detail mattered: the tilt of a portrait, the glint of sunlight on gold, the uneven dust of a rarely used corridor. Each was a silent cue in a centuries-old dialogue between loyalty and discovery. Camilla's butler gave a subtle nod, barely perceptible, signaling readiness. The guard's eyes followed the faint line of the panel, noting every imperfection, every clue that history had left for those capable of seeing. Their combined awareness created a tension-filled rhythm, a silent choreography of discovery and restraint. The palace itself seemed to pulse with anticipation, aware that the first act of revelation was imminent. A faint metallic click echoes through the hallway, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. The threshold has been reached, and the next steps will uncover more than gold or artifacts. Loyalties will be tested, secrets revealed, and the moral weight of centuries presses down on every choice. What lies beyond this door will challenge not only duty but conscience itself. The faint click of the hidden panel echoed like a heartbeat through the corridor. Time seemed to slow, the air thick with anticipation and the weight of centuries. Camilla's butler, standing just beyond the threshold, paused. His fingers hovered over the key now resting in the guard's hand, a silent reminder of the moral and historical responsibility that accompanied access. Beyond this door lay more than artifacts. It held the consequences of generations of secrecy, carefully curated and deliberately preserved. The guard inserted the key, its metallic edges cool against his fingers. The lock responded with a precision that was almost musical, a soft chime, a whisper of mechanisms long undisturbed. Dust rose faintly in the narrow beams of sunlight that filtered through the corridor's hidden windows. The palace seemed to inhale, aware that its oldest secrets were about to be confronted. The door swung open slowly, revealing a chamber of muted grandeur. Velvet-lined display cases glimmered faintly, holding relics untouched by hands alive today. Stacks of manuscripts tied with faded ribbons rested atop low pedestals, their edges frayed with the passing of decades. The air carried a faint metallic tang, the scent of history and hidden treasures. Every object told a story, not of wealth alone, but of moral decisions, treaties, compromises, and secrets carefully shielded from view. Camilla's butler stepped forward first, not to lead, but to guide subtly. He gestured to the guard, whose trained eyes catalogued every detail, noting the placement of each artifact, the orientation of manuscripts, and the subtle signs that some objects had been deliberately positioned to convey warnings or lessons. The treasure room was more than a repository of wealth. It was a moral archive, preserving decisions, loyalties, and ethical compromises from centuries past. As the two men moved deeper into the room, flashbacks flickered in the butler's mind. He remembered the Queen's meticulous orchestration of secrecy, the careful instructions, the discreet hand signals, the coded notes hidden in plain sight. Every element of palace life had been designed to protect both material and moral integrity. He realized that what they were seeing was the culmination of decades of deliberate concealment, a tangible manifestation of the monarchy's silent ethical stewardship. The guard approached a gilded chest, its surface etched with intricate symbols. He hesitated, sensing that the act of opening it was not simply physical, but symbolic. Camilla's butler offered a quiet nod, a gesture of permission tempered by caution. The chest creaked open, revealing artifacts that were more than ornaments, signed treaties, correspondence hinting at clandestine alliances, and documents suggesting moral compromises made in the shadow of power. Each piece was a revelation, challenging assumptions about loyalty, integrity, and the human cost of governance. The camera drifts over the room, capturing the interplay of light and shadow across polished surfaces. Dust motes float like tiny spectres, illuminated in golden shafts of sunlight. The silence is almost absolute, punctuated only by the soft rustle of manuscripts and the careful footsteps of the guard and butler. It is a sacred silence, a meditation on the weight of history and the ethical burden of those entrusted with its protection. Tension rises as a small, unexpected detail captures the guard's attention, a faded letter tucked behind a display case. Its seal, partially broken, suggests recent tampering. The implications are immediate. Someone within the palace may have known more than they revealed, or worse, may have acted to exploit the treasure. The moral stakes intensify. Discovery is no longer abstract. It is urgent, pressing, and ethically charged. Camilla's butler, sensing the guard's apprehension, leans closer and whispers, "Not everything here is as it seems. Trust your observation, but temper it with discretion. Some truths are meant to guide, not to expose." His words carry the gravity of a lifetime of service, the accumulated wisdom of decades spent navigating the delicate balance between duty and conscience. A sudden noise interrupts the quiet, a subtle shift in the corridor beyond the chamber, a faint footstep, perhaps, or the whisper of a staff member unaware of the unfolding drama. Both men freeze. The palace holds its breath once more. The weight of secrecy is immediate, palpable, and morally binding. Each decision now carries consequences not only for themselves, but for the integrity of the institution they serve. The guard's eyes scan the room systematically. Every artifact, every manuscript, every golden edge of a display becomes a clue in a complex moral and historical puzzle. The butler provides subtle guidance, indicating items of significance without revealing all their meaning. Together, they navigate the space like a pair of skilled archivists, balancing discovery with the ethical implications of exposure. Flashbacks deepen, the Queen herself reviewing the placement of objects decades ago, instructing trusted staff in quiet corridors, emphasizing the moral weight of what they were safeguarding. Every instruction, every coded note, every strategic concealment now resonates with new significance. The room is not merely a repository of treasures, but a testament to human decision-making under the strictest of ethical codes. The first confrontation with moral ambiguity arises unexpectedly. The guard notices a collection of treaties that, if exposed, could implicate not only historical figures but current members of the palace staff. Camilla's butler steps forward, a quiet hand on the guard's shoulder, guiding judgment without imposing it. "Some knowledge is for understanding, not action," he murmurs. The guard absorbs this, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like an invisible mantle. The camera pans to a faintly illuminated corner of the chamber where a small reliquary catches the light. Its contents hint at scandal, compromise, and decisions made behind closed doors. The artifacts are not dangerous in themselves, yet their moral resonance is profound. The butler's eyes linger for a moment, reflecting a lifetime of awareness that what is discovered may challenge loyalties, reveal ethical compromises, and force re-evaluation of personal codes. As the two men continue their careful exploration, subtle signs of prior access become apparent. Dust displaced unevenly, fingerprints on gilded handles, faint impressions in the velvet lining of a chest, all suggest that the treasure room, while secret, is not untouched. Someone has been here before. The realization heightens tension. The palace's equilibrium is not just threatened by discovery, but by possible internal complicity. The guard's hand moves instinctively, cataloging these traces without disturbing them. Camilla's butler observes, aware that knowledge of prior intrusion introduces moral complexity. Every observation, every decision, becomes a test of judgment, balancing duty, loyalty, and ethical responsibility. The treasure room, once a symbol of hidden wealth, has transformed into a crucible for human conscience. The emotional midpoint emerges as the butler steps back, absorbing the enormity of what lies before him. His mind recalls every decision, every act of discretion, every moment of silent service that led to this point. He feels the weight of history pressing down, aware that what they uncover could reshape not only perception of the monarchy, but also the moral compass of those serving it. The palace, in all its grandeur, has become a mirror reflecting the choices of those within. The guard moves toward a set of ornate documents, their seals intact, yet fragile. He hesitates, recognizing that opening them is more than an act of curiosity. It is a moral choice. The butler's subtle nod signals understanding. They must proceed with care, guided by principle as much as protocol. The act of revelation is now intertwined with ethical responsibility, and the consequences will extend far beyond the room itself. A soft breeze drifts through a hidden vent, disturbing a layer of dust and carrying the faint scent of aged parchment. The palace seems alive, aware of the unfolding drama. Shadows stretch across the walls, flickering over gilded surfaces, and the tension escalates. Every object, every trace, every whisper becomes part of a moral and historical narrative that challenges loyalty, conscience, and judgment. The climax of Part 2 approaches, a discovery that combines historical significance with moral ambiguity. A chest, partially hidden, contains documents and artifacts that, if exposed, could implicate multiple generations in ethical compromise. The butler steps forward, guiding the guard through this revelation, emphasizing discretion while acknowledging the weight of truth. Every decision here is a test of judgment, loyalty, and the ability to reconcile duty with conscience. As the room settles into quiet reflection, the camera lingers on the artifacts, the key now resting on a velvet display, and the two men poised between revelation and restraint. The palace itself seems to exhale, aware that the first wave of moral reckoning has begun. The treasures are more than physical objects. They are the embodiment of ethical history, of choices preserved in secrecy, and the challenge of navigating their consequences has only just begun. A sudden noise, a whisper, a footstep, the faintest creak hints that they are no longer alone. Loyalty and trust are about to be tested further, and the next revelation may upend everything the palace has carefully safeguarded. The moral and historical stakes have never been higher. The palace, once a sanctuary of ritual and predictability, now felt different. Its grand halls seemed heavier, shadows deeper, and the subtle scent of aged wood mingled with the faint metallic tang of recently disturbed gold. Camilla's butler moved through the corridors with his usual poise, yet his steps were measured, almost hesitant. The treasure room had been explored, the key had served its purpose, and now the palace itself seemed to whisper warnings that history had left behind. The guard followed quietly, cataloguing every detail of the shifting atmosphere. His trained eyes caught subtle deviations, a velvet drape slightly askew, a polished marble floor scuffed where no one should have walked, a faint draft suggesting a hidden passage. Each anomaly carried weight. The palace had become a crucible where duty, loyalty, and morality converged, and even the smallest oversight could ignite a cascade of consequences. Camilla's butler paused at the entrance to the hall, where the faint echo of voices reached his ears. Whispers, careful and deliberate, floated just beyond reach. He knew these were not casual murmurs. They were the first threads of suspicion, the subtle ripples of knowledge spreading through the palace staff. The air felt charged with unspoken questions. Who knew what, and how far would they go to protect their own interests? The camera drifts down the hallway, capturing gilded frames and polished surfaces that gleam under soft lighting. Each portrait, each carved panel, seems to bear witness. The eyes of painted monarchs follow the butler and the guard, as if aware that the balance of secrecy and betrayal is shifting. Even the silence is loaded, heavy with anticipation and dread. A sudden movement catches the guard's attention. A junior staff member, unaware of the investigation, pauses, their gaze lingering on the now empty corridor that leads to the treasure room. The butler notices immediately and steps slightly ahead, guiding the guard along an alternate path to preserve discretion. In that small gesture lies the complexity of their mission, maintaining secrecy while navigating the first signs of internal betrayal. Back in the administrative chambers, subtle confrontations begin to take shape. The investigators, having reviewed ledger entries and cross-referenced staff statements, confront small inconsistencies in accounts. The butler's name comes up more than once, not in accusation but in inquiry. Questions are phrased politely, formally, but the moral pressure is unmistakable. Trust and doubt coexist in the same breath. The guard observes from the doorway, noting the expressions of each administrator. Some maintain perfect composure, others betray slight hesitation, brief flashes of unease that suggest knowledge withheld or alliances unspoken. The palace in all its grandeur now feels less like a building and more like a living organism, sensitive to every ripple of suspicion. Meanwhile, Camilla's butler retreats to a quieter corridor. He leans against the polished wall, his thoughts heavy. Loyalty had guided every choice in his life, yet the discovery of the treasure room has complicated that foundation. Duty, discretion, and conscience are no longer separate paths. They intersect, collide, and demand resolution. The moral weight of his actions presses down like the palace's own vaulted ceilings, a tangible force in the still air. The camera follows him past hidden alcoves and long corridors lined with tapestries. Each piece depicts a story of human frailty, moral compromise, and concealed truth. Battles fought, decisions made, and alliances forged in secrecy, all mirrored in the palace itself. He moves through these visual echoes of history, aware that the same forces shaping the past are now testing the present. A whisper drifts from a side corridor, almost imperceptible, yet loaded with significance. Another staff member, aware of minor irregularities, moves cautiously, listening, observing. Suspicion spreads quietly, like a shadow across the polished floors. The palace is no longer simply a place of order. It is a stage where trust, betrayal, and ethical reckoning are playing out in subtle gestures, in half-spoken questions, in the tension between human curiosity and institutional discipline. Camilla's butler enters a small, dimly lit chamber, often used for confidential meetings. He pauses, taking a moment to reflect on the moral calculus of his life. Each choice, each act of discretion, now feels amplified. The weight of centuries presses on him. The treasure room, the key, the ledger, all are symbols, but also catalysts, forcing confrontation with personal and collective conscience. The guard joins him, and for a moment they simply observe the space, absorbing its silence. It is a silence that speaks louder than any words. The palace itself has witnessed every act of loyalty, every betrayal, every moral compromise, and now it is observing again, waiting for the next movement, the next choice that will tip the balance. The first subtle act of betrayal emerges in plain view. A minor administrator, trusted in routine duties, is discovered handling documents outside the usual protocols. Nothing overtly criminal, but the deviation is enough to spark tension, a quiet ripple that spreads through the hierarchy. Loyalty is questioned, alliances are reconsidered, and even the butler, seasoned and wise, senses the fragility of trust. The camera pans across the hall, capturing the interplay of light and shadow. Velvet drapes ripple with faint drafts, polished surfaces reflect glimpses of movement. Every detail is magnified, each hint of irregularity carrying moral and historical weight. The palace in all its opulence has become a theater of human complexity, where even small actions can redefine allegiance and conscience. The guard's attention shifts to subtle cues, the angle of a shadow, the faint indentation of a footstep, the nervous glance of a staff member. Each observation is a thread in a tapestry of moral tension. The palace, meticulously maintained for centuries, is now a crucible of human behavior, testing the limits of loyalty and ethical judgment. Camilla's butler moves with deliberate care, guiding the guard through hidden passages and less frequented corridors. They navigate a delicate dance of discretion and observation. Every encounter, every whispered conversation, every glance carries potential significance. The discovery of the treasure room has awakened a chain reaction of suspicion and ethical questioning that now flows through the veins of the palace itself. The emotional midpoint emerges as the butler pauses in a shadowed alcove. He reflects on the subtle betrayals and human frailties that have been exposed, whispers that conceal more than they reveal, glances that imply knowledge of secrets, and the quiet decisions that may undermine or protect loyalty. The palace, with all its grandeur, now mirrors the complexity of human morality. Choices are never simple, and actions have consequences that ripple far beyond the immediate moment. A faint sound, a door closing somewhere deep in the palace, breaks the quiet. The butler and guard exchange a glance, aware that observation alone may not be enough. Trust has become a currency more valuable than gold, and the slightest misstep could unravel both personal and institutional integrity. The palace, once a monument to continuity and order, now feels precarious, suspended on the delicate edge between revelation and betrayal. The camera lingers on the portraits lining the halls, the eyes of monarchs painted long ago seeming almost to judge. Every figure, every historical echo, reminds the observers of the consequences of secrecy, the cost of ethical compromise, and the importance of discernment. The palace itself is a character now, silent yet omnipresent, its shadows heavy with memory and expectation. A deliberate act, a minor concealment, a furtive handling of documents hints that betrayal has begun in earnest. Loyalties are being tested, trust is fraying, and the moral weight of discovery presses down on every individual. The palace waits, patient, and unyielding, as the next chapter of ethical reckoning prepares to unfold. The faint rustle of paper echoed through the otherwise silent corridor, a sound that carried weight far beyond its volume. Camilla's butler paused mid-step, eyes narrowing as he observed a junior administrator hastily concealing documents within a locked drawer. The gesture was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the consequences were immense. In the palace, even the smallest act of concealment could set in motion a series of moral and procedural upheavals. The guard, positioned a few paces behind, registered the act with trained precision. Every movement within these halls, once routine, now carried the potential to reshape trust, to unravel loyalties, and to expose ethical compromises preserved for decades. Shadows stretched across the marble floors, elongating in silent judgment, as if the palace itself were aware of the first threads of betrayal being woven. Camilla's butler stepped forward quietly, intercepting the administrator without confrontation. "Some things are meant to remain in shadow," he said softly, his voice measured, deliberate. "But if you choose to hide what should be seen, the consequences extend beyond your understanding." The administrator froze, eyes wide, as the weight of centuries of protocol and duty pressed down upon him. In that moment, the palace became both judge and witness, its silent corridors amplifying the moral gravity of the interaction. The camera glides along the corridors, capturing the interplay of light and shadow across gilded surfaces. Velvet drapes sway gently in the palace's draft, as if reflecting the shifting currents of loyalty and suspicion. Each portrait lining the walls seems alive, the eyes of painted monarchs observing, silently judging the unfolding choices. Here, history is not passive. It participates, lending weight to every whisper, every hesitation, every glance that betrays a concealed intention. The guard catalogued every nuance, the subtle rise and fall of the administrator's shoulders, the nervous shifting of weight, the avoidance of eye contact. In these small details, he saw the first tangible signs of fracture within the palace hierarchy. Loyalty was no longer absolute. Discretion had become selective, and trust was beginning to fray. The palace, in all its grandeur, now felt fragile, vulnerable to human error and moral compromise. Camilla's butler guided the guard down a hidden staircase leading to a chamber often used for confidential correspondence. Here, letters were exchanged in secrecy, each word carefully measured, each seal chosen with intention. He gestured toward a bundle of papers, tied with a ribbon that had been hastily undone. The guard's fingers hovered over them, sensing the weight of the decisions encoded in ink and parchment. Each letter carried consequences, some immediate, others echoing across decades. As they examined the documents, a series of whispered confessions began to surface. Staff members, compelled by curiosity, guilt, or fear, revealed fragments of knowledge about prior access to the treasure room. Some admitted seeing the key or observing unusual entries in the ledger. Others confessed to misplacing documents or deviating from standard protocol in ways that had previously gone unnoticed. Each revelation, while subtle, heightened the tension, creating an intricate web of human fallibility and ethical complexity. The butler, listening carefully, weighed each confession against his decades of experience. He understood that disclosure carried risk not only of exposure, but of undermining the fragile equilibrium of trust within the palace. Yet he also recognized the moral imperative. Knowledge of betrayal must be acknowledged, not ignored. In these quiet corridors, every decision was amplified, every omission magnified, and the line between loyalty and complicity became razor thin. A sudden creak echoed from the upper corridors, alerting the guard and butler. Both paused, eyes scanning the dimly lit chamber. Shadows shifted unnaturally, suggesting someone moving unseen. The palace itself seemed alive, each whisper of sound carrying moral significance. It was a reminder that secrecy, once disturbed, could not easily be restored. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the building itself awaited the consequences of human choice. Camilla's butler gestured toward a small alcove, where another bundle of correspondence had been tucked away. The guard approached cautiously, noting signs of recent disturbance, fingerprints on polished surfaces, minor indentations in the dust, subtle irregularities that betrayed prior handling. Whoever had been here had moved with knowledge and intent, guided by their own agenda. The discovery raised profound questions about loyalty, trust, and the personal morality of those serving the palace. The emotional midpoint reached its crescendo as the butler reflected on his own role. Years of service, countless acts of discretion, and unwavering loyalty were suddenly tested by betrayal occurring under his very eyes. He felt a surge of regret, of quiet sorrow, realizing that even the most faithful could falter when temptation or fear intervened. The palace, magnificent and imposing, had become a mirror reflecting human frailty, echoing centuries of moral compromise and ethical choice. The guard, too, experienced the weight of the moment. His sense of duty, once simple and procedural, now intersected with a profound moral question. When loyalty conflicts with truth, how does one act? Each step through the corridors, each glance at disturbed objects or whispered confession, forced him to confront the human dimension of ethics. The treasure room had revealed more than artifacts. It had illuminated the fragile lattice of trust upon which the palace depended. Subtle confrontations began to emerge in hushed alcoves and shadowed corridors. Staff members who had been complicit in minor deviations now confronted one another, their whispers carrying accusations, questions, and self-justifications. Each interaction intensified the atmosphere of moral uncertainty. Loyalty was questioned, alliances reconsidered, and ethical boundaries tested. The palace, silent and imposing, seemed to absorb each conflict, amplifying its emotional and moral weight. The camera pans across hidden letters, manuscripts, and artifacts, capturing the tension in every shadowed corner. Faint glimmers of gold catch the light, but the true treasure is the understanding of human choice. The small compromises, the deliberate concealments, the moments when conscience wrestled with duty. Every object, every whisper, every glance now carries layered significance. Camilla's butler leads the guard to a final concealed passage, one whose existence had been hinted at in earlier ledger entries. The space is narrow, lined with polished wood and aged tapestries that conceal centuries of secrets. Here, the betrayals converge, as if the palace itself has funneled human frailty into a single locus of consequence. The guard senses the moral magnitude of what lies ahead. The decisions made in this chamber will ripple far beyond the walls themselves. A sudden realization strikes. The treasure room's artifacts, the hidden correspondence, and the subtle acts of concealment are all part of a broader moral narrative. The palace has been a stage for human choices, where loyalty and betrayal intersect, and the consequences of ethical compromise reverberate across generations. The weight of history presses down, demanding recognition and deliberate judgment. As the two men pause in the narrow passage, the palace seems to exhale. Shadows lengthen, drapes sway gently, and the faint scent of aged parchment and polished wood fills the air. The confrontation with betrayal, once abstract, is now concrete. Whispered confessions, concealed letters, and minor acts of disobedience have transformed the palace from a monument of stability into a crucible of moral reckoning. A deliberate act of concealment or revelation looms on the horizon, a choice that will irrevocably challenge loyalty, trust, and ethical judgment. The palace waits silently, its corridors and alcoves bearing witness to the unfolding drama. What is done next will shape both the present and the moral legacy of those who serve within its walls. The palace corridors, once thick with whispers and tension, now exhaled a quiet, deliberate calm. The shadows of betrayal had not vanished entirely, but their edges softened under the steadying rhythm of resumed duty. Camilla's butler moved through the halls with a careful grace, his presence a reminder of continuity, discipline, and the human cost of loyalty. Every step he took echoed softly against marble floors, a metronome marking the careful restoration of order. The guard followed, observing not just the physical state of the palace, but the subtle reordering of its human ecosystem. Staff moved with renewed purpose, eyes alert but measured. No one spoke loudly of the recent discoveries. Silence was the language of discretion here. Each corridor, each doorway, each polished surface reflected both the continuity of service and the quiet weight of moral responsibility. The palace itself seemed to lean into this restored rhythm, absorbing the lessons of recent events while maintaining its unwavering presence. Camilla's butler paused in the grand atrium, gazing at the towering portraits that lined the walls. Each monarch seemed to observe, silently acknowledging the endurance of duty through the centuries. He reflected on the treasure room, the ledger, and the subtle betrayals that had surfaced. Knowledge of secrets, he realized, was never merely information. It was responsibility, heavy and exacting, carried by those who serve quietly, often unseen. The camera drifts across the atrium, capturing sunlight filtering through the tall windows, glinting off polished railings and gilded moldings. Dust motes float in the warm light, almost like fragments of history, suspended in a moment of reflection. The atmosphere is serene yet charged with the weight of past choices. Each object, each surface, each shadow reminds the observers that the palace is more than a building. It is a living archive of human decisions, ethical compromises, and enduring loyalty. The guard approaches a staff member, one whose minor acts of deviation had been noted during the previous investigations. The conversation is quiet, formal, measured. No accusation is made. The focus is on understanding, on restoring equilibrium. Loyalty, the guard knows, is not simply obedience. It is the careful navigation of ethics, discretion, and conscience. The staff member nods, a subtle acknowledgement that lessons have been learned and that duty remains paramount. Camilla's butler continues his rounds, checking the subtle markers that indicate order and discipline. Doors correctly latched, documents properly archived, ceremonial items returned to their places. Each small act reinforces the palace's continuity and serves as a reminder that responsibility is both collective and personal. Even after the revelations of the treasure room and the whisperings of betrayal, the structure of duty persists, its moral framework intact yet tempered by recent human failings. The emotional midpoint is reached in the quiet of the library, where the butler reviews the ledger once more. Pages lie open, notes cross-referenced, and subtle annotations catalogued for preservation. Here he contemplates the weight of choice, what to reveal, what to conceal, and how to guide the palace through the delicate balance of transparency and discretion. Every entry, every signature, every coded note carries moral significance, and he knows that stewardship of these secrets is as consequential as any physical task. Meanwhile, the guard inspects the corridors leading to the treasure room. It remains sealed, its contents undisturbed, preserved not only for security, but for the ethical principle it embodies. The act of safeguarding these artifacts is itself a moral choice, a reminder that power, history, and discretion are intertwined. Knowledge is not freedom, it is responsibility, and the weight of that responsibility rests on those who are entrusted with it. The palace staff, now returning to routine duties, demonstrates a renewed understanding of the hierarchy and the subtle boundaries of loyalty. The butler observes interactions with a careful eye, noting where trust has been reinforced and where fragility lingers. Even small gestures, a bowed head, a careful acknowledgement, a delayed response, carry the weight of ethical calibration, echoing lessons learned from the recent upheaval. The camera follows the pair along shadowed corridors, capturing minor imperfections corrected and ceremonial standards reaffirmed. Every restored surface, every corrected misalignment, becomes a symbol of regained balance. The palace, both imposing and delicate, stands as a testament to the endurance of duty, the moral complexity of human service, and the quiet heroism of those who act with discretion and integrity. The butler pauses by the treasure room, glancing at its locked door. He does not enter, nor does he need to. Its presence is a reminder of both temptation and restraint. The artifacts within are not merely symbols of wealth or history. They are ethical tests preserved in form and substance. The guard nods, understanding that vigilance is not about force but judgment. The palace, he realizes, is a living ethical framework, and the custodianship of secrets is as vital as the enforcement of protocol. The camera pans over the grand halls, catching subtle reflections on polished floors, glimmers of light across gilded frames, and faint shadows that hint at the continuity of life within the palace. Silence here is not emptiness, it is measured attention, a reverent acknowledgement of responsibility, and a recognition that every human action carries moral weight. Even after upheaval, the palace asserts continuity through careful maintenance of both space and ethical principle. Camilla's butler and the guard converge briefly in the central atrium. Their eyes meet, not in triumph but in quiet understanding. They have navigated revelation, discretion, and the moral ambiguity of knowledge. Each has borne the weight of choice, and each recognizes that duty is not a static state, but an ongoing negotiation between conscience, loyalty, and institutional integrity. The emotional close of Part 1 emerges in a private alcove where the butler reflects on human cost. Years of service, decades of vigilance, and countless acts of quiet heroism culminate in this moment of contemplation. The palace, majestic and patient, observes silently. The moral lessons of the treasure room, the subtle betrayals, and the reaffirmed loyalty coalesce into a singular understanding. The weight of duty is profound, and its endurance requires courage, discretion, and conscience in equal measure. As the palace settles into disciplined calm, the locked treasure room remains a silent sentinel of history, ethics, and human choice. The next moments will test reflection against action, conscience against protocol, and the enduring tension between loyalty and truth. The resolution is near, but the palace's moral legacy will continue to unfold in quiet, measured ways. The palace exhaled in the early afternoon light, a soft sigh that seemed to settle dust and tension alike. Corridors that had carried whispers of betrayal now resonated with quiet purpose. Camilla's butler walked slowly, hands folded behind his back, each step deliberate, echoing faintly against polished marble floors. The weight of the past days hung upon him, yet there was clarity now, a sense that duty, though heavy, had been honored. The guard followed, his movements equally measured. His eyes, once alert to hidden threats and moral ambiguities, now surveyed a palace in cautious equilibrium. The staff moved with renewed composure, aware of past mistakes but committed to integrity. In this controlled rhythm, the palace itself seemed to breathe again, reaffirming order through the subtle cadence of footsteps, the careful handling of documents, and the meticulous arrangement of ceremonial objects. Camilla's butler paused near the grand atrium, looking up at the portraits of monarchs past. The painted eyes seemed to observe, as if acknowledging the weight of service carried by those within these halls. He reflected on the treasure room, the ledger, and the minor betrayals that had rippled through the palace. Knowledge, he knew, was never neutral. It demanded judgment, discretion, and moral courage. And in this silence, he understood that the human cost of loyalty was often invisible, carried quietly by those who serve without fanfare. The camera drifts slowly down the corridors, catching shafts of sunlight on polished floors and glinting surfaces. Dust motes float like fragments of memory, suspended in the glow. The atmosphere is serene yet heavy with reflection. Every hallway, every alcove, every gilded frame reminds the viewer that the palace is not simply a building, but a living archive of human choices, ethical dilemmas, and enduring loyalty. The guard approaches a junior staff member whose minor acts of deviation had caused earlier ripples of concern. Their conversation is calm, formal, and measured. No recrimination is voiced. Instead, there is acknowledgement, guidance, and a subtle reaffirmation of duty. Loyalty, the guard recognizes, is not blind obedience, but a careful balance of conscience, discernment, and institutional responsibility. In this quiet reconciliation, the palace itself seems to absorb the lessons learned, solidifying the restored equilibrium. Camilla's butler continues his rounds, inspecting subtle markers of order. Ceremonial items return to precise positions, documents correctly filed, doors securely latched. Each gesture, each small act of care, becomes a symbol of regained moral and institutional balance. Even after disruption, the palace persists, not merely in physical integrity, but in the ethical stewardship of its history and secrets. In the library, the butler reviews the ledger one final time. Pages lie open, meticulously cross-referenced, annotations preserved for future guardianship. He considers what must remain confidential, what may be revealed, and how best to guide the palace's custodians in the ongoing balance between transparency and discretion. Knowledge carries weight, he reminds himself, but the true responsibility lies in how it is managed, preserved, and respected. The guard moves to inspect the corridor leading to the treasure room. The door remains sealed, untouched, a silent monument to restraint and moral stewardship. Its contents, though known to a select few, are preserved not merely for security, but as a living symbol of ethical responsibility. Vigilance, he understands, is less about enforcement than judgment, knowing what to see, when to act, and how to honor the trust placed upon him. The palace staff resumes routine, demonstrating quiet understanding of hierarchy, responsibility, and loyalty. The butler observes carefully, subtle gestures of respect, the reinforcement of trust, the return to discipline. Even small movements, a bow, a careful glance, a muted acknowledgement, carry significance, reflecting lessons internalized from prior upheavals. The palace, in its grand silence, becomes both teacher and witness, ensuring that ethical principles endure through its custodians. Camilla's butler pauses by the treasure room, key long returned to its secure place. He does not enter. The artifacts themselves need no further exposure. Their presence is sufficient, a reminder of temptation, discretion, and moral accountability. The guard stands beside him, understanding that vigilance is as much internal as external. The palace is a living ethical framework, and stewardship requires courage, judgment, and patience. The camera captures the interplay of light and shadow across the atrium. Sunlight glints off gold, polished wood, and marble, yet it is the subtle reflections, the quiet order, the disciplined steps, the attentive care, that speak most profoundly. Silence is not emptiness, but a language of responsibility, acknowledgement, and solemn reflection. Each act of service, each preserved secret, embodies the weight of duty carried by those who serve the palace faithfully. The butler and guard converge in a small alcove, sharing a brief, silent acknowledgement. No words are necessary. They understand the journey they have undertaken and the moral terrain navigated. Loyalty has been tested, discretion exercised, and judgment upheld. Each has borne the burden of responsibility, and the palace itself stands as witness to the quiet heroism of service. The emotional close emerges in the final corridors. The butler reflects on decades of service, minor acts of discretion, and countless decisions made in silence. He recognizes that the human cost of loyalty is often invisible, but its impact is profound. The palace, patient and imposing, preserves history and ethical lessons simultaneously. The weight of duty is not diminished, but it is acknowledged, honored, and carried forward by those who remain steadfast. The guard, too, reflects on the experience. His sense of responsibility has expanded beyond protocol. It now encompasses moral discernment, judgment, and the protection of legacy. Duty is no longer a set of procedures, but a conscious, deliberate engagement with ethical stewardship, a covenant between past, present, and future custodians. The palace settles into calm, corridors quiet yet alive with memory, lessons, and enduring vigilance. The treasure room remains sealed, a monument to discretion and responsibility. Staff resume their tasks with measured diligence, aware of both human frailty and the enduring standards of loyalty and duty. Each movement, each careful choice, is an act of moral continuity. The palace stands, patient and unyielding, as history and ethics continue to intertwine. Secrets remain, lessons endure, and vigilance persists. The next chapter of reflection begins, a quiet meditation on human cost, loyalty, and the sacred responsibility of preserving what is entrusted to those who serve. The palace, now quiet in the late afternoon light, seemed almost suspended in time. Corridors that had echoed with whispers, secrets, and urgent steps now lay serene, bathed in a gentle glow filtering through high windows. Camilla's butler moved slowly, each step deliberate, carrying with him not the haste of duty but the contemplative weight of decades of service. The events of the treasure room, the betrayals, and the reconciliations had passed, yet their echoes lingered like faint vibrations in the air. The guard walked behind him, scanning the familiar halls with a softer vigilance. His senses, once alert for immediate threat or moral compromise, now absorbed the subtleties of the palace's character. The faint creak of a hidden floorboard, the glint of sunlight across polished brass, the rustle of a velvet curtain disturbed by a passing breeze. Each sound, each shadow, each reflection carried the memory of choices made, lessons learned, and the delicate calculus of loyalty maintained under pressure. Camilla's butler paused at a locked door, one of countless in the palace that remained closed to most. He rested a hand lightly on its carved surface, feeling the subtle vibrations of history pressed into wood and metal. These doors were more than architectural features. They were custodians of memory, guardians of secrets, and silent witnesses to human action. Behind each one lay stories untold, moral decisions preserved, and the quiet labor of those entrusted with safeguarding them. The camera drifts slowly along the corridor, capturing the interplay of light and shadow across the polished floors and gilded moldings. Dust motes float lazily in the sunbeams, like fragments of history suspended in time. The palace itself seems to breathe gently, aware of the stillness, aware of the delicate balance between exposure and discretion, between action and restraint. It is a place where human choices, ethical dilemmas, and loyalty intersect in a form almost tangible, almost alive. The guard approaches a nearby cabinet, carefully examining documents and artifacts returned to their proper places. Each item, each ledger, each sealed envelope represents more than information. It is a repository of ethical responsibility. He notes the precision of arrangement, the subtle signs of care, and the absence of disruption. In these quiet acts, he recognizes the enduring human dedication to duty. the unseen heroism that preserves continuity in the face of temptation, error, or ambition. Camilla's butler moves through the inner chambers, pausing at a collection of ledgers chronicling centuries of palace decisions. He reflects on the weight of discretion, on the quiet heroism of those who act without recognition, and on the moral consequences of knowledge. Each ledger tells stories of loyalty tested, trust broken or preserved, and the silent courage required to safeguard what must remain unseen. These records are more than paper. They are moral artifacts, vessels of conscience that demand respect, reflection, and thoughtful stewardship. The emotional midpoint emerges in a small alcove where light falls in a golden pool across the floor. The butler sits briefly, hands folded, eyes tracing the lines of a tapestry depicting a centuries-old royal council. He contemplates the countless human decisions woven into the palace's fabric, compromises made in shadows, alliances formed and broken, choices weighed and often concealed. Loyalty, discretion, and conscience intertwine here, forming an invisible lattice that supports both the palace and the ethical framework of those who serve within it. The guard pauses beside him, noting the solemnity of the moment. His role, once focused on immediate duty and enforcement of protocol, now encompasses understanding and reflection. He perceives that vigilance is not only external but internal. The awareness of the consequences of knowledge, the discernment required to act rightly, and the quiet courage to preserve what is entrusted without exploiting it. The palace teaches this lesson silently, its corridors echoing with the weight of centuries. Camilla's butler rises, moving again through the labyrinth of hallways, pausing at doors and alcoves where the faintest signs of history remain. The indentation of a key once used, the soft discoloration of wood from decades of handling, the subtle smell of parchment aged with care. Each of these markers is a reminder that even the smallest actions, every choice to protect, conceal, or reveal, carries significance. The palace, majestic and patient, bears witness to the human cost of duty in every grain of its material and every shadowed corner. The camera lingers on a row of locked doors, each unique in design yet unified in purpose. Behind them are secrets that may never be known, treasures whose significance is as much moral as material. The butler's hand rests lightly on one, not to enter but to acknowledge its presence. These thresholds are more than barriers. They are symbols of responsibility, quiet monuments to discretion, and tests of the character of those who serve. The palace ensures that what is hidden remains protected, yet it also challenges those who walk its halls to bear the weight of knowledge faithfully. The guard follows, observing the subtle interplay of light and shadow across the ornate walls. He notices the quiet care in the arrangement of objects, the precise alignment of ceremonial artifacts, and the absence of disorder in spaces once disrupted by investigation. Each correction, each act of restoration, is a moral gesture as much as it is practical. It affirms that responsibility is not merely about guarding wealth or enforcing rules, but about sustaining the ethical integrity of the palace and those who serve it. Camilla's butler pauses before a small reliquary, its contents carefully sealed and untouched. He reflects on the journey that led them here, the discovery of the treasure room, the confrontations with human frailty, the subtle betrayals, and the eventual restoration of equilibrium. The artifacts inside are more than historical objects. They are repositories of moral memory, symbols of the choices made and the lessons preserved through decades of service. They remain unseen, yet their significance is immeasurable, a testament to the enduring weight of duty. The camera drifts upward, capturing the vaulted ceilings, intricate moldings, and the soft light filtering through tall windows. The palace itself seems alive in its quiet reflection, a monument to human decision, discretion, and conscience. Each corridor, each room, each locked door tells a story of vigilance, moral courage, and ethical responsibility. The viewer feels the resonance of centuries of quiet heroism, preserved in silence, yet unmistakably present in the space around them. The emotional close of Part 1 emerges in the hush of a corridor far from the central halls. Camilla's butler and the guard stand together, observing the palace in patient stillness. They do not speak. Words are unnecessary. The lessons of loyalty, discretion, and moral responsibility are evident in the order restored, in the locked doors, and in the quiet dignity of service. Their reflections, shared silently, encompass the human cost of duty and the weight of knowledge preserved without fanfare or recognition. As sunlight fades and shadows lengthen, the palace waits patiently behind locked doors, carrying lessons of loyalty, conscience, and human cost. What remains unseen is as powerful as what has been revealed. The final moments will meditate on the enduring significance of service, discretion, and the moral legacy entrusted to those who guard history itself. The palace, now settled into a profound stillness, seemed almost to breathe in rhythm with its silent custodians. Corridors that had once carried tension, urgency, and whispered betrayals now lay bathed in soft twilight. Camilla's butler moved slowly, deliberately, tracing the familiar halls with a gaze that measured more than space. It measured history, choice, and the invisible moral weight that hung in every room. The guard followed, not as an enforcer, but as a witness. His steps, once quickened by uncertainty and duty, now mirrored the calm rhythm of observation. In the polished reflection of a window, he saw not only the contours of the palace, but the reflection of vigilance, restraint, and moral fortitude. Every surface, every artifact, every locked door carried the imprint of human decisions. Some courageous, some flawed, all consequential. Camilla's butler paused at a door he had never opened, resting his hand lightly on its surface. Behind it lay a secret, preserved by centuries of discretion, waiting silently for a moment when it might be needed, or perhaps never to be revealed. The key had long since returned to its vault, the ledger carefully archived, and yet the weight of knowledge remained. This weight was not a burden alone. It was a testament to the responsibility that service demanded, to the quiet heroism of those who protect what history entrusts to them. The camera glides slowly along the corridor, capturing the play of fading sunlight on gilded moldings, dust motes floating lazily in warm rays. The palace is at once monumental and intimate, a living repository of human choice. Shadows stretch across polished floors, tracing the invisible paths of past decisions, whispered warnings, and acts of conscience. Here, every object, every surface, every silence has moral significance. The guard pauses beside a display of artifacts from prior generations, carefully catalogued and preserved. He studies the arrangement, noting that order itself is an act of ethical stewardship. Each item, properly maintained and respectfully stored, reflects the values of those who served before. The weight of duty is not in force or authority, but in the meticulous preservation of history, conscience, and trust. Camilla's butler continues through the inner chambers, pausing at a set of ledgers chronicling centuries of palace activity. He reflects on the countless acts of discretion, loyalty, and subtle moral courage preserved within these pages. Here, decisions made quietly, without recognition or applause, have maintained continuity and ethical integrity. Each page tells a story, not only of events, but of the human choices that shaped their unfolding, choices made in shadow, guided by conscience, and upheld by silent dedication. The emotional midpoint emerges in the courtyard, where fading sunlight casts long, tranquil shadows. The butler and guard stand side by side, observing the serene gardens. Birds stir in the trees, wind shifts leaves, and the palace walls glow softly in the golden light. Here, in this quiet intersection of nature and history, reflection finds its form. The past events, the treasure room, the whispering betrayals, the restored order, are present not as drama but as lessons. Duty, loyalty, and ethical responsibility have endured, yet they are understood now with a calm awareness of their human cost. The camera pans across long corridors, polished floors, and locked doors. Each threshold is more than a barrier. It is a symbol of moral responsibility, a reminder that some knowledge is not for display but for preservation. The palace itself is an ethical organism, guiding those within its walls to balance action with discretion, conscience with loyalty, and vigilance with humility. In this space, human choice is amplified, responsibility magnified, and quiet heroism rendered visible only in its consequences. Camilla's butler pauses at the vault where the key and ledger reside. He does not open it. He merely acknowledges it, understanding that power and knowledge are inseparable from ethical restraint. The guard observes, equally aware that preservation is the truest act of duty. Together, they represent continuity, the human guardians of a legacy that must endure, protected by judgment, conscience, and careful restraint. The palace seems to settle further, as if recognizing the deliberate stillness of its custodians. The corridors, the halls, the hidden alcoves, each carries centuries of decisions, moments of courage, and acts of discretion. Light and shadow move across polished surfaces, reflecting not only architecture, but the moral choices embedded in its history. Silence here is eloquent. It is the voice of responsibility, reflection, and ethical continuity. The emotional close emerges in the quiet of the library. The butler and guard pause together before the ledgers, letters, and artifacts. They consider the magnitude of what they have safeguarded, the weight of decisions they have witnessed, and the silent heroism of those who came before. No words are spoken. The recognition is mutual, the acknowledgement complete. The palace itself bears witness, timeless and patient, preserving the legacy of vigilance, discretion, and ethical responsibility. The palace keeps its silent vigil. Locked doors, hidden corridors, and preserved artifacts remain, each a testament to human choice, ethical duty, and the quiet heroism of service. History remembers, but only those entrusted with its secrets can fully bear the weight. Beyond these walls, untold stories await. Another threshold, another act of conscience, another echo of loyalty waiting to be revealed.